So I've been using the Galaxy S8 as my main smartphone every day since it came out, and I didn't rush to do an S8 review as soon as it launched because products like this, especially super high-end flagships, deserve a bit more time to actually play with them, to get used to them, to figure out all their kinks and quirks and see what's good and what's not so good. So I've held back a little bit. It's now been a month since this came out, and I wanted to give you my sort of review of it now, but as well as that, just sort of everyday thoughts on it, tips and tricks, a few things that have come up, stuff that perhaps other reviews don't cover as much. So when I first got the S8, I went to meet a friend at the pub in London, and I was kind of chuffed I had the S8. I sort of wanted to show it off, even though he's not that big into tech. He probably didn't care that much. He was just humouring me. So I was like, oh, look, this is the new Galaxy S8, have a play with it. And he says, what's new with it? I was like, well, I'm glad you asked. So I explained about the bezel and the screen, and it's HDR. It's got a Snapdragon 835 processor, or the Exynos 8895 here in the UK, by which point I think he completely glazed over and started having a drink from his pint. I mean, on paper, this fancy new 10nm architecture of the processor, great, but it's not something that most of us, if any of us, can really appreciably tell the difference on. So at this point, I was thinking, okay, maybe I'm struggling a little bit to explain the differences beyond the new design. So I said, well, the camera's improved. It's still 12 megapixels, still f1.7 from the S7, but it's got a slightly new sensor, and there's a few new nifty multiple photo tricks it does and things. Nothing groundbreaking there. It's got double the storage, 64 gigabytes, USB-C, HDR screen. He's like, oh right, yeah, you've heard of HDR TVs. I said, yeah, it's pretty similar. This is actually the only phone to be HDR certified by the UHD Alliance. At which point I think he glazed over again. He said, oh sweet, so can you show me something in that? No, because at the time, and I still think now, there's actually no way of properly watching or at least streaming HDR content on the S8. So I said, but it's it's future-proof. Amazon and Netflix will update their apps, and YouTube and things like that. So eventually we'll get HDR on here. But right now I couldn't really show that off. So at this point I was sort of struggling a little bit to explain beyond the design and the display difference what exactly was new and why he'd want to upgrade and pay £689 for the S8. So that's the first thing that kind of stood out for me. Beyond the design, it was kind of hard to explain why anyone needs to upgrade to this. A couple of other things to mention about the design. It's a massive fingerprint magnet, as you can probably see. But the good news is, unlike the S7, the camera lens must have a slightly different glass because that actually does not smudge at all, pretty much, compared to the rest of the body. But then that also draws us to the new fingerprint reader, which is obviously on the back here next to the camera. It's not on the front. We've got no physical buttons down here whatsoever. It's just a weird placement, and you do put your finger on the camera lens, and you have to get your finger fully on it. It's just a bit of a pain. Honestly, I don't like the fingerprint reader very much, but there is some good news, and that's because the face recognition biometric sort of security option is really good, and actually much better, I think, than the iris scanner, which is also an option on here. So you have the fingerprint reader, you've got your PIN, you've got your password, you've got iris, facial recognition. There's so many ways of unlocking your phone. Fingerprint reader is annoying, but it's sort of mitigated by the great facial recognition. The next thing I want to talk about is Bixby, which is the new Samsung assistant that for some reason they thought they needed to include because the Google Assistant isn't good enough or something. And honestly, it's a pain in the arse. It really is just unnecessary in my opinion, and a bit annoying because you've actually got a dedicated Bixby button here. Bixby button. It just takes like an extra second or so than you'd like to load, and I just don't see why this is necessary. You got all this with the Google Now, Google Assistant. You've got some fancy camera features where it can detect what you're looking at and then search for images or search for shopping. It doesn't work particularly well, at least here in the UK. I think that feature is also coming to the Google Assistant soon as well. So I don't get it. I really don't get it. But you can just not use it, which is one thing, and you can also get rid of it from the home screen. You just click the button there and get rid of it from the home screen, although the button still will work. As for camera quality, I am dead impressed with this. This has a phenomenal camera. I think technically it may not be quite as good as the Google Pixel, and it's also going to be interesting to see how it compares with the new HTC U11, which DxOMark gave a 90. But despite that, the dual pixel autofocus, the wide f1.7 aperture, all things that were present on the S7, you get fantastic depth of field. It's really fast to autofocus, really, really bright. It's genuinely an amazing camera, and actually one of the best reasons to go out and buy one of these. As for battery life, well, it's not that great. It's got a 3000 milliamp hour battery in it, and by the end of the day, an average working day, which has a bit of power saving mode, and I don't tend to use games that much, I have about 30% of battery left by 10 p.m, that sort of thing. So yeah, it'll get you through a full day, but you're going to need to charge it pretty much every night. At the same time, it also defaults to a full HD resolution rather than the WQHD, which is kind of what they advertise this with, and that's presumably to save battery. I can't tell the difference between full HD and QHD unless you put the phone right to your eye and start looking at the little pixels around the text. You can't tell, so I'm quite happy to leave it on full HD. Although from my experience, if you do whack it up to WQHD, that'll take around 8 to 9% of your battery life off per day. Another issue that a lot of people had when the S8 came out was having a red screen, a bit of a red tint to it. Fortunately, my model didn't have that problem, although there has been a patch, a software update you can get, which should fix that, although I think it just tweaks the settings a little bit. But honestly, I think if I did have that red issue on my phone, I'd return and replace it. I wouldn't want to rely on a software update, which I think just reduces the red color on the screen. I don't want to use that as a solution. I want, a good, proper working model. So I'd change that, although I was quite lucky not to have that issue. One thing I get asked quite a lot is, does the Edge screen have the same palm rejection issues you get on the S7 Edge? And the answer is no. Fortunately, they've improved it. The Edge is far less severe. The actual screen doesn't go around nearly as much as it did on the S7 Edge, which means your palm does not sort of get in the way of the screen as much. As for software, well, it is a lot nicer, I would say, than, say, the S6 or the S7. That's because they've gone with this new Samsung Experience UI. I'm sure that is just a slightly renamed TouchWiz. It just looks nicer. I do quite like the icons here. You can actually change these navigation icons as well or add more. Generally, it is a nicer experience. It's still not as good, in my experience and my personal opinion, to stock Android like you get on the Pixel. It's not as fast. This does sort of fall over itself every now and then. There's a couple of hiccups, but generally, performance is great on this. So I've had a month with the S8 using it every single day, and I really, really like it. I think it is the best phone you can buy right now. The camera, the display, the build, the design, the fact that it's got double the storage with 64 gigabytes, it's got USB-C. It's just all these little things that add up to make it just almost the perfect smartphone. Things like Bixby are annoying, and the camera isn't particularly better than the S7, although a little bit. And once you get past the design and the fancy bezel, perhaps there isn't a huge amount to get excited about. That's why, as I say, I was struggling to explain the power of a Snapdragon processor or why HDR screens are useful right now to my friend Will in that story. If you want to find out more or even buy one of these, I will put links in the description below this video. And if you already own an S8, let me know in the comments below what you make of it and whether you have any tips or tricks to get the most out of the phone. Hopefully you found this useful and you've enjoyed the video. If you did, please click that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up below. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time right here on the Tech Chat.